The confession came in a secure phone call at 3:47 a.m. Tehran time on January 14, 2026. A senior official from Iran's Ministry of Health, speaking on condition of anonymity, delivered numbers that shattered the regime's carefully constructed narrative. About 3,000 protesters had been killed nationwide since December 28th, including hundreds of security officers. The official's voice, transmitted through encrypted channels to contacts in Dubai, carried the weight of a collapsing state. But it was the next revelation that sent shockwaves through commodity markets from London to Singapore. Iran's oil exports, the lifeblood of its economy and a critical component of global energy supply, might cease entirely within days. By dawn in New York, crude oil futures had spiked 9%, breaking through $62 per barrel for the first time since October. But the real action was in precious metals markets, where silver began a parabolic ascent that would redefine crisis investing. The connection between Iranian oil and silver prices might seem tenuous to casual observers. Yet for those who understood the intricate web of global trade, the logic was inescapable. Iran's oil revenues didn't just buy food and medicine, they funded the delicate balance of power across the Middle East. Without those revenues, the region's fragile stability would shatter, and in that shattering, only physical assets beyond the reach of sanctions, revolution, or state collapse would retain value. The evacuation order for Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar added urgency to an already explosive situation. Reuters reported that American personnel had been instructed to leave by Wednesday evening, a clear signal that military planners expected significant escalation. The base, home to over 10,000 U.S. troops and the forward headquarters of CENTCOM, had been targeted by Iranian missiles in previous confrontations. Its evacuation suggested that intelligence agencies saw more than protests in Iran. They saw the potential for regional war. In Tehran's Grand Bazaar, where protests had first erupted over currency collapse and economic misery, the violence had reached unprecedented levels. Videos smuggled out despite internet blackouts showed security forces using live ammunition against crowds. The human rights activist news agency, compiling reports from sources across Iran, documented the systematic nature of the killing. 2,403 protesters dead, 147 government personnel, including 12 children who weren't even participating in demonstrations. The numbers climbed hourly, each death adding to the regime's desperation and the likelihood of even more extreme measures. But it was in the oil fields of Khuzestan that the real economic drama unfolded. Workers at the Abadan refinery, Iran's oldest and most symbolic petroleum facility, hadn't just gone on strike. They had begun systematic sabotage. Pumping stations reported mysterious failures. Pipeline pressures dropped without explanation. Export terminals experienced technical difficulties that prevented tanker loading. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which controlled much of Iran's oil smuggling operations, found their own networks compromised by defections and deliberate disruption. The workers' message was clear. If the regime wanted to kill its people, the people would kill its revenue. The mathematics of Iran's economic survival had always been precarious. Despite decades of sanctions, the country had maintained oil exports of roughly 1.5 million barrels per day, mostly to China, paid for in yuan and gold to circumvent dollar restrictions. These sales generated approximately $30 billion annually, not much for a nation of 85 million, but enough to keep the Revolutionary Guards paid and basic subsidies flowing. Without oil revenue, the regime had perhaps 6 weeks of foreign exchange reserves. After that, complete economic collapse was inevitable. This reality drove the extraordinary scenes now playing out across the Middle East. In Dubai's gold souk, Iranian traders worked through the night, desperately converting whatever assets they could move into precious metals. Turkish border guards reported unprecedented attempts to smuggle silver across the mountainous frontier. Even in Baghdad and Damascus, cities with their own troubles, Iranian expatriates lined up at currency exchanges, trading reals for anything tangible. The price didn't matter anymore, preservation did. The silver market's response reflected more than just Iranian demand. Geopolitical analysts had long warned that Iran's collapse could trigger a regional conflagration. Saudi Arabia and Israel, united in their opposition to Tehran, might seize the opportunity to eliminate Iranian proxies. Turkey could move to prevent Kurdish independence. Iraq might fragment entirely. Each scenario meant disrupted oil supplies, currency crises, and the kind of systemic uncertainty that drove investors to history's most reliable crisis hedge. Silver, with its dual monetary and industrial nature, offered unique advantages in such chaos. By midday, London time on January 14th, the London Bullion Market Association reported extraordinary activity. Physical silver premiums reached 35% above spot prices, higher than during the COVID pandemic, higher than the 2011 squeeze, approaching levels not seen since the Hunt brothers' corner in 1980. But unlike those previous spikes driven by speculation or temporary disruption, this premium reflected fundamental supply and demand. Iranian buyers needed silver immediately. Industrial users needed to secure supply before potential war disrupted shipping. Western investors, watching another Middle Eastern country implode, sought assets beyond any government's reach. The Pentagon's contingency planning, leaked through usual channels to financial media, painted stark scenarios. If Iran's regime fell, securing the Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of global oil flowed, would require massive naval deployment. If Iran's nuclear facilities fell into uncertain hands, preemptive strikes might be necessary. If refugee flows destabilized neighboring countries, humanitarian intervention could follow. Each possibility meant higher oil prices, currency instability, and the kind of deep uncertainty that made precious metals essential portfolio insurance. Inside Iran, the regime's attempts to maintain control grew increasingly desperate. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps announced that any attempt to disrupt oil production would be met with revolutionary justice, a euphemism for summary execution. But the threats rang hollow when the executioners themselves were defecting. Videos showed security forces laying down weapons, some even joining protesters. In the oil fields, workers didn't just strike. They formed protective committees, using their knowledge of critical infrastructure to prevent regime loyalists from restoring production. The revolution hadn't just reached the streets, it had reached the source of regime power. China's response added another layer of complexity. As Iran's largest oil customer, Beijing faced an impossible choice. Supporting the regime might secure energy supplies, but would align China with a government massacring its people. Abandoning Iran would sacrifice energy security and strategic influence. The compromise, continuing to buy oil while publicly calling for restraint, satisfied no one. More importantly for markets, it signaled that even Chinese demand couldn't save Iran's oil sector if workers refused to produce and export infrastructure was sabotaged. The financial contagion spread far beyond commodity markets. Iranian banks, already isolated from global systems, faced complete collapse as citizens withdrew whatever deposits remained. The rial, having lost 90% of its value over years, entered hyperinflationary freefall. But most disturbing for regional stability, the network of financial institutions across the Middle East that had facilitated sanctions evasion began unraveling. Banks in Dubai, Istanbul, and Beirut that had profited from Iranian trade suddenly faced existential questions about counterparty risk. If Iranian institutions collapsed, who would honor obligations? This banking crisis drove yet another wave of silver demand. Middle Eastern wealth, traditionally held in real estate and bank deposits, sought safer harbors. The metal that had served as money in Persian bazaars for millennia reclaimed its role as regional currency. But modern demand dwarfed historical precedent. Where ancient traders might have exchanged silver dirhams by the handful, modern wealth required metric tons. The physical infrastructure of precious metals markets, vaults, transport, insurance, strained under unprecedented volume. The U.S. State Department's carefully worded statements revealed Washington's dilemma. Supporting protesters aligned with stated values of human rights and democracy, but Iran's collapse could unleash regional chaos that made Iraq and Syria look manageable by comparison. The evacuation from Qatar suggested military planners were preparing for worst-case scenarios. Special envoys shuttled between capitals, seeking some framework to manage collapse rather than prevent it, but diplomacy moved at human speed while events accelerated at digital velocity. President Trump's characteristic response, "Iran should be very careful," carried more weight given recent actions in Venezuela. The capture of Maduro had demonstrated American willingness to use military force for regime change. Iranian officials watching Venezuelan events unfold understood the implicit threat, but this understanding only increased their desperation. If the choice was between massacre and invasion, the regime seemed prepared to choose massacre. This calculus, coldly rational from their perspective, drove protesters to even greater desperation and oil workers to more complete sabotage. The technical indicators in silver markets showed classic panic patterns, but with unprecedented scale. The gold-silver ratio, traditionally between 61 and 81, compressed toward 15:1 as silver outperformed every other asset. Options markets priced in not just volatility, but directional explosion. Call options at $150 per ounce traded actively despite being 100% above current prices. The forward curve inverted drastically, indicating immediate supply shortage rather than future speculation. These weren't normal market dynamics, they were the footprints of systemic crisis. Industrial users added their own desperate demand. Samsung's procurement teams authorized purchases at any price to maintain production. Solar panel manufacturers, already struggling with Chinese export restrictions, now faced double supply shocks. Medical device companies warned that silver shortages could impact critical equipment manufacturing. The convergence of monetary demand from Iran and industrial demand globally created what economists called a perfect storm, except this storm was measured in troy ounces rather than meteorological pressure. The human tragedy behind market movements defied quantification. Each of the 3,000 confirmed deaths represented a family destroyed, a community traumatized. The videos emerging despite internet blackouts showed scenes reminiscent of Syria's civil war, except this was a nuclear-capable nation with advanced military systems. Children shot while attending school, medical workers killed treating wounded protesters, elderly bazaar merchants beaten to death for refusing to open shops. The violence had passed any threshold of government legitimacy, entering the realm of systematic slaughter. This humanitarian catastrophe intersected with market dynamics in unexpected ways. International relief organizations, needing to move funds into Iran for emergency assistance, found traditional banking channels closed. Some turned to precious metals as transfer mechanisms, buying silver in Dubai, smuggling it across borders, converting it to local currency for aid distribution. This humanitarian demand, small in absolute terms but symbolically significant, added to pressure on already strained physical markets. The oil infrastructure attacks escalated throughout January 14th. Explosions at the Bandar Abbas refinery suggested coordinated sabotage beyond spontaneous worker resistance. The Karg Island terminal, responsible for 90% of Iran's oil exports, reported complete shutdown after critical control systems were destroyed. Whether by regime opponents or foreign intelligence agencies, the systematic destruction of oil capacity appeared irreversible in any reasonable time frame. Iran's oil weapon, long feared by Western planners, was being turned against the regime itself. Regional responses varied, but shared common themes of self-preservation. Saudi Arabia mobilized troops to its northern border, ostensibly for humanitarian purposes, but clearly prepared for refugee flows or military opportunism. Israel's security cabinet met in continuous session, debating whether Iran's chaos offered opportunity or threat. Turkey sealed its borders while paradoxically facilitating precious metals smuggling, a profitable contradiction typical of Ankara's pragmatic approach. Each neighbor prepared for Iran's implosion while contributing to capital flight that accelerated collapse. The afternoon of January 14th brought new revelations that shocked even cynical observers. Iranian intelligence officers, defecting en masse, provided Western agencies with documentation of regime contingency planning. If protests couldn't be suppressed, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps was prepared to destroy oil infrastructure entirely rather than let it fall into opposition hands. The scorched earth strategy, reminiscent of Saddam Hussein's Kuwait withdrawal, would eliminate Iran's economic value while potentially triggering environmental catastrophe. The documents, authenticated by multiple sources, suggested implementation had already begun. This revelation triggered the day's most dramatic market moves. Oil prices spiked another 5% in after-hours trading. Shipping insurance for Persian Gulf routes became effectively unavailable at any price. But silver's reaction was most telling, a vertical move that broke through $80 per ounce with barely a pause. The metal wasn't just pricing in Iranian demand or regional instability, it was pricing in the possibility that a major oil producer would voluntarily destroy its own capacity, removing millions of barrels from global markets permanently. Central banks, traditionally measured in their responses, took extraordinary actions. The Federal Reserve opened unlimited swap lines with major allies, preparing for potential dollar shortages if oil prices spiked further. The European Central Bank announced emergency liquidity provisions for banks with Iranian exposure. The Bank of Japan intervened in currency markets to prevent yen appreciation that could damage exports. But most significantly, multiple central banks were reported to be buying physical silver, not for monetary reserves but for industrial contingency planning. If supply chains shattered, strategic stockpiles would be essential. The corporate response revealed how deeply Iran's crisis had penetrated global planning. Apple's Tim Cook canceled all public appearances to focus on supply chain contingency. Tesla's board convened emergency sessions on silver procurement. Microsoft announced delays in data center expansion pending raw material availability. These weren't companies with direct Iranian exposure. They were recognizing that Iran's collapse could trigger cascading failures throughout interconnected global systems. When the dominoes started falling, distance provided little protection. As markets closed in New York, the enormity of the situation was crystallizing. Iran, a nation of 85 million people, was experiencing state collapse in real time. Its oil production, critical to global energy balance, faced systematic destruction. The refugee flows, regional conflicts, and economic disruptions that would follow were beyond immediate calculation. But markets, in their cold efficiency, had already begun pricing these outcomes. Silver at $80 per ounce wasn't speculation, it was preparation. The night brought no respite. Reports from Tehran described running battles in wealthy northern districts where regime loyalists made their last stands. The Evin prison, symbol of regime oppression, was stormed by crowds seeking to free political prisoners. Government ministries burned as protesters seized documents proving decades of corruption and brutality. But most ominously, explosions echoed from industrial districts where oil infrastructure was being systematically destroyed, whether by regime forces implementing scorched earth or revolutionaries ensuring the old order couldn't return. International efforts at mediation collapsed before they began. The United Nations Security Council remained paralyzed by Russian and Chinese vetoes. The European Union offered humanitarian assistance that couldn't be delivered without functioning infrastructure. Arab states pursued individual agendas rather than coordinated response. The United States, burned by previous Middle Eastern interventions, limited itself to protecting existing allies rather than managing Iranian collapse. The international system revealed its fundamental inadequacy when faced with state failure of this magnitude. Yet through all this chaos, one constant remained: the relentless bid for physical silver. Dealers reported that entire national inventories were being depleted. Refiners worked overtime to transform raw ore into deliverable bars. Mints suspended commemorative programs to focus on basic bullion production. The metal that had been monetary afterthought for decades was reclaiming its historical role as chaos currency. When paper promises became worthless, when governments fell and currencies collapsed, when oil itself could be destroyed by its own producers, only physical metal retained meaning. The implications extended far beyond Iran's borders or immediate crisis. If a major oil producer could implode so completely, if 3,000 deaths could trigger systematic infrastructure destruction, if regional powers would exploit rather than stabilize chaos, then fundamental assumptions about global order required revision. The post-Cold War dream of economic integration preventing conflict had died in Iranian streets. What emerged from its ashes would reshape not just Middle Eastern geography, but basic concepts of security, value, and survival. As January 15th approached, with Iranian oil exports effectively ceased and death tolls climbing toward 4,000, the world confronted uncomfortable truths. Energy security couldn't be taken for granted when producers could destroy their own capacity. Currency stability meant nothing when states themselves became unstable. International institutions proved impotent against domestic collapse. In this new reality, only assets with intrinsic value, independent of governments, immune to political chaos, recognized across cultures and centuries, offered protection. Silver's ancient role as crisis money had been validated by Iran's modern tragedy.